All right, good morning. This is Dr. Knotts, and I want to speak to you today on codependency. The reason why I'm broaching this subject is I thought it was pretty common knowledge about what real codependency is and how to treat it and how to identify it. But I was wrong. I sat through a lecture a few weeks ago, and it still bothers me because the person that was lecturing was treating a room full of codependent people. I continually re-educate and try to stay on top, and it's everything professionals do. They're required to take CEUs or at least to stay on top. I do it because within 10 years you'll forget up to 50% of the information you know if you're not constantly relearning, reevaluating, and rebuilding. So as I'm sitting through this lecture on codependency, the lecturer, or I guess you'd say the counselor, not only didn't understand what codependency was, he had a common belief that is pretty prevalent today, at least in the United States, as to what codependency is. So I want to teach you about where codependency comes from, the roots of codependency, how it's developed within the psychological system of the individual, then how it's actuated. But also, not only that, how to identify when somebody's codependent, the varieties of codependency, and then how to treat it. Codependency, first of all, starts in a person's early years. Codependency is not something that just happens later on in life. A person can graduate into codependency, and I'll talk about that in a few moments. But the majority of people have the roots of codependency from their early childhood. And I'll explain what I mean. Codependency will begin in a household where the household has what I call either turmoil or dysfunction. There's a social acceptance that is widespread today in the United States because so many homes are dysfunctional. The dysfunctional home has become what they call the norm now, and it shouldn't be. A home, the way God intended it, a normal home is a place where people are nurtured, where not only are they nurtured, but they feel secure, they feel loved, and they bond. And they bond and they have joy, they have peace, they have fellowship. As far as it goes, man is not created to be an individual that's alone. Human beings, one of their basic needs is they have to have the capacity fulfilled for love, acceptance, desire. Part of a person's healthy, or what we call psychological wholesomeness, is in the fact that they need to be loved. They need to know that they're loved. They need to know that they're accepted. They need to know that they are desired. A child needs to know that their parent loves them. Their parent accepts them. Their parent desires to have them there. Their parent desires to spend time with them. You see, it's not a matter of poverty. It's not a matter of being wealthy. It's not, any fiduciary aspects have nothing to do with it. You can have a functional home that is normal or the way God designed it in any type of setting. But also you can have a dysfunctional home in any type of setting. So the codependency of an individual, its roots go all the way back primarily to the between the years of 3 and 4 in their psychological development. And here's why. Their personality is not fully developed yet, but it's developing, and it's working on the middle part of what we'd call Maslow's hierarchy, what I call the fourth layer of the unconscious. So if you have a home where there's turmoil within the home, in other words, one or more of the spouses has an anger problem, or one or more of the spouses has a drug or an alcohol problem or a sexual problem or or abuse, or there's psychological abuse, there's physical abuse, there's neglect. If you have a home where one or more of the spouses or caretakers neglect the child, neglect each other, where there's static and turmoil in the home, it will begin creating what we call the profile for codependency. Now, codependency is a trained self-defense coping mechanism. Now, some people will question you and say, well, what do you mean self-defense? What does self-defense have to do with codependency? And I'm glad you asked. Because a codependent person is somebody who feels like they need to adapt in order to survive. Now, here's the problem. When I say they feel, I don't mean the person who's out in the front, because you remember we're talking between the ages of 3 and 4. And a 3 and a 4-year-old is, first of all, they're egocentrical. They think everything in the world revolves around them. And by this, I mean, it means they believe that their actions influence the way others act. Their actions will influence the way that they're treated, whether kindly, negatively, whether people spend time with them or don't spend time with them. Their actions, they believe that their actions will be the cause of adults fighting or not getting along. And it's because they haven't developed the frontal lobes yet. And so they don't understand that each person is independent. It's not until well after they get their independence that they'll start seeing people responsible for their own actions. And that's around the age of 12. So codependency has its roots in the childhood. Now, here's what happens with codependency. And here's where I'm going to define codependency. Codependency is when you find an individual who is close to someone that is either addicted to a behavior, a lifestyle pattern, on narcotics, alcohol, work, something that takes them out of what we'd call the sphere of being a normal functioning family unit member. Now, a family unit can be a dyad, which means 2 individuals, or a triad, where it's 2 individuals and a child, or, you can go on and keep adding. But what happens, and here's how it can be graduated into later, and you'll say, well, what about the person that hooks up with somebody in their 20s or 30s and then becomes a codependent? Well, they don't just become a codependent. You see, the roots are there from their childhood. And this is what will happen. If you have a child that's raised in a home where the man is very demeaning to his wife, or austere, or abusive, then that child, if it's a female and the male is the one that's the dominant, or because a female will always see their father as the highlight of the home, the male child will see the mother. So what will happen is that child will seek out an individual to replace the one that they were never satisfied, or their conscience never felt accepted by. You see, the brain feels like it has to be accepted as a child. It feels like that's its one role and task at that time period. And so when you have a daughter raised in a home where she doesn't feel accepted, she will seek out partners, whether male or female. For instance, if the mother is the abuser and the father allows it to happen and makes excuses, like you got a codependent father, then it can cause lesbian traits, or what we call homosexual traits, in the daughter, and she'll constantly be seeking out the ability to please a female. So these roots go all the way back, and they're very dominant in the way they affect the conscience of the child later on in the 20s and 30s. So this is what codependency is. Codependency is when somebody will be with another person, they'll feel close to them, They don't have to be married. They don't have to be spouses. You have many people that have friends that they are codependent on. And here's the science and how you can do it. The person will adjust their lifestyle in order to facilitate the other person's bad behavior, addictions, or irresponsibility. The person will not only adjust their behavior and their lifestyle, but they will make excuses for it. They will go into denial. Now, I did a lecture on denial, projection, and codependency. And that's what got me hit with some questions on codependency and why I felt like I needed to further reiterate and go a little deeper into it than that lecture also. So what will happen is they will adjust their lifestyle in order to enable that the person that needs to repent or change to continue in their lifestyle. So a codependent person is somebody that has had an upbringing to where they were trained and conditioned to make excuses for bad behavior, sinful habits, abuse, addictions, areas where another individual has fallen short. And depending upon the degree of how far they have fallen short, that will kind of be a measuring stick for how far and how strongly a person will be a codependent. Codependent is not somebody that has to be with another individual. A codependent is literally somebody that partakes within that other person's addiction, lifestyle, or behavior. This is why you can have a person who's raised in an alcoholic home and they'll say, well, I'm never going to drink. But then what happens is later on they gravitate to it. You can have a person that's raised in an abusive home and they'll hate that abuse, but when they get older, they'll become just like it. Or they will find somebody that is an abuser because they have that unfulfilled need to be accepted, to be loved, to be nurtured. People need to be nurtured. You see, it's not all nature. In other words, it's not genetics. Nurturing is the primary tool in behavioralism. The genetic foundation does not predominate within the conditioning of behavioralism. Behavioralism comes from the nurturing or the aspect within the home and the conditions and the elements that come together. So there are three ways that a codependent will respond. Okay? And I'm going to tap into that in just a second. Some examples of codependency. A lady who is with an abusive, whether verbally, physically, both, or sexually or psychologically abusive boyfriend or mate. And they will be in denial about what's really happening, and they'll make excuses and they'll adjust their lifestyle. I tried to work with one not too long ago, and the individual had their neck covered with a sweater, and it's incredibly hot if you know anything about, Florida and such. I said, why is your neck all covered up? And the person goes to uncover their, they immediately put their hands around, what do you mean? They pull their thing tighter. What are you covering your neck up for? And what's that bruise? It looks like a bruise sticking out the side of your neck. And I said, pull the top of your sweater down. So they do this, and I look, and it is fingerprints. And I said, do you have a mirror? Can you take your, I'm talking to the individual. I said, can you walk over to a mirror in your home? Because I'm doing this through Skype. Do you see what I'm seeing? Well, yes. I said, no, you don't. You're in denial. And to make a long story short, the person was with a psychopath who uses them as a beating cushion. And I'm tried to break them out of that denial. But you see, because of homeostasis, a person that's raised in that environment, codependency, they covered up for daddy when daddy would have beat the mother and then abused the children. They made excuses. They learned to lie. They learned to cover up. But then when they got older and became an adult, they sought out people that were abusive, and they go from relationship to relationship to relationship. And they'll always seek out someone because they've never been satisfied from the relationship they had in their own household. Father never loved mother right. He abused her. Father abused the children. Father was unpredictable. That's a good example of how codependency is created. That's also why that sin is graduated onto the child, and the child becomes an adult. And what will happen is, if that person ever does get married and has children, or gets pregnant and has children, the child will be raised in that environment and will become codependent also. Codependency is when you enable a person to live a lifestyle that is against what would be social norms. And I like to use the term biblical norms because we live in a society today where America is filled with codependence. So that brings us down to most people think codependency has to do with just alcohol and drugs. It doesn't. Eating disorders, you can have a person that, a man that loves his wife very much, and she can be 100 pounds, double body weight. And they will live in denial because they've been raised to make excuses and to enable the person. Like I had said in the former video, the 600-pound guy, they had to cut the wall out in order to move him with a fork truck and to bury him in a piano coffin because they don't make coffins that big. The other person in the home, the other parts of the family, were taking the food to them. This guy couldn't move. Everybody had adjusted their lifestyle to keep feeding this guy like a hog. And, when asked why, they said, well, he would cry, he would scream, he would cuss. I said, you know what? Good. I said, you should have held a carrot out at arm's length in front of him and made him get up and try to move for it. People have to clean up after him. He can't even use the toilet. I'm kind of hard and gruff when it comes down to it, but I'm very loving. So here's the 3 ways that they'll respond. The first is they will either become a rescuer or a victim. The rescuer is the one that will try to make everybody feel okay. It's going to be okay. They'll bring comforting words. And this is the person that's strongly in denial. And the rescuer is the one that will always try to help people get right. When they get older, they will find people who have problems and they will try to fix them. They will join themselves to people that need to be fixed. Then you have the one of the victim. The victim is the one that will find people that are abusive or that will repeat the role, and they will become the victim. And they'll complain and they'll hate it, but they won't be able to stop themselves from seeking out an environment or situations, events that will happen to replicate what had happened in their childhood. The second aspect is how it will work within their behavior. So the first is, this is the 3 ways that codependency works out. First is the person will either become a victim or a rescuer. Second is they will become the perpetrator. Their behavior will mimic and sometimes escalate and have additions to whatever it was that was abnormal within the home. They'll be a workaholic, except they'll work more than what their father worked or their mother worked. They'll be a sexual addict, even more so. They'll be into alcohol, drugs. They'll have borderline personality disorder. In other words, they'll do things that are extreme. Their behavior could be perfectionism. The second way that codependency will work is it'll be the way of either the behavior will be affected by it. They'll either be a rescuer, a victim, or perpetrator. They will be influenced and triggered by alcohol, drugs, money, sex, food, there's always a tie to it, an emotional tie that is also associated with a physical tie. Um, I remember listening to a lecture by a hypnotherapist, Joe, and I can't remember his last name, but he was out of HMI, and he works with biofeedback a lot, and he works with heroin addicts and stuff, and he would tell them in the group, the guy would say, I need to go get a fix of heroin. He'd say, no, you don't. What it is, you've just been triggered. If you give me 5 minutes, I can show you that you are actually responding to a trigger, that you really don't need the heroin. And so things will trigger. It's emotional and it's physical. And here's one of the main problems is in the triggering phase, depending upon how, and this is where it's called ritualistic behavior, how often the behavior happened in the home, there will be an internal clocking mechanism within the individual that will mimic whatever it's been conditioned and trained to do. For instance, if there was fights on a weekly basis, or say, for instance, the person went out and blew their whole paycheck on Fridays, the man did, he came home drunk on Saturday or Sunday, they would fight, and then maybe once a month or every other month the mother would pack her bags and leave. That will develop within the child that same pattern. They will have fights on a weekly basis. They'll blow up and they'll leave once a month. Then they'll go back and they'll restore. In other words, they will recreate. They'll have a timing mechanism in them to recreate. And that's very important to understand, because if somebody had an abusive person that would mull things over and every fourth or fifth day would come in and just beat their children or beat their wives. And I've, many years ago when I was working with victims of abuse, child and adult survivors of physical and sexual abuse, I found this to be a common pattern. Especially I worked with a lot of Hispanic people. And, the wife said, we're Catholic. We love God, but my husband beats me every night. So there's a little bit of a contradiction there. You can't love God if you don't love others. But I found that there was common patterns where people would have, if you were to document it, you'd see a routine to where there would be a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-day pattern. And that'll be replicated in the codependent person. So here are the traits and characteristics, and you can go to the DSM, Diagnostic Statistic Manual. There's many things written that'll be similar to this. So here's how you can identify the codependent person or the person who has the behavioral control issues. A codependent person will be driven, or the behavioral person, by one or more compulsive habits, things they can't control, they can't stop. You can call them demonic strongholds, but they will feel helpless and hopeless to be able to change. The man, I can't tell you how many times I've heard men say, I don't want to hurt her, I just can't help. And this is not the proper way to do it, but earlier on when I was a pastor, I would say, well, it's like this. If you put another bruise on her, I'm going to put 10 on you. And, I had several times individuals attack me. How dare you tell me that? I'd say, I'm telling you this because I'm a man and you need to not hit women or children. And, I didn't punch them out or anything, but I would lift them up by the side of their neck and their rib cage and shake them in the air and hold them off their feet on the air, dangling by their neck and their side of their ribs. And because I used to tear bark off of trees for hours as a martial artist, a Shaolin martial artist. And I'd say, now you're going to stop or I'm going to hurt you. See, one of the things that'll break an abuser loose is when they realize it's going to happen to them. But they need salvation, they need repentance, and they need that demonic stronghold taken out of them. They need behavioral modification change. The person will be driven by one or more compulsive habits they feel unable to change. Food addiction in the United States has become probably the greatest of the addictions, far exceeding that of alcohol and drugs. Why? Because sugar is a drug, and nowadays they have modified sugars. I think there's 42 different types of sugar now being used that are synthetic. Most of them are synthetic, and that means they've been designed to activate reward centers in the brain. So in essence, what they've done is they've created synthetic drugs in the form of sugars. The second thing is the person will be bound. It'll be a demonic stronghold, and they will be tormented by the way things were in their original family relationships. In other words, there'll be things from their childhood that haunt them, that they may not even remember. And, the individual I quoted about their neck being all bruised up, I said, tell me about your early childhood. And the person immediately said, well, my father was great. It's funny, you got a family of 5 or 6 or 7, and you immediately just bring up one individual. Tell me what was great about him. And they went on to talk about him, and then I said something that I knew would trigger them, and I watched them trigger, and I watched them then start talking about how abusive he was, not to them, but to the other people in the house. So I let them talk for almost 10 minutes, and then I totally changed the subject. I said, hey, what's your favorite Beatles song? What color is your car? What's the first car you ever bought? You say, well, why would you do this? Because you can't break a person out of denial talking about the defense mechanisms protection ward. In other words, you can't go through the barrier. So you have to relax the individual's mind by talking about something totally unrelated, but that they would enjoy. And what it does is it takes the barrier that's been created between the 4th and the 5th level, and it puts it back down because it's no longer needed. We're not going there. Brings them up into a reward center area, and then I will throw in something. Hey, how good is your math? What's 2 plus 2? 3 minus 5? Go as fast as you can. I want to see how fast your brain will work. I'll throw off 5 or 6, and then I'll talk about colors, numbers, and music again. I like to end on music, and here's why. It activates the reward center of the brain. Music is one of the things that bypasses all the filters within the brain and allows the brain to enjoy things. Many people relieve stress through music. And then I was able to say, do you realize you were talking about how great your father was, and then immediately within 5 minutes you switched to how abusive he was? I did? Yeah, you did. And so here's the thing. They'll have things from their families that torments them. Next, they will have an incredibly low self-image. And they won't admit it. Many times they will try to do the opposite. They call it the opposite or the extreme. They will try to act like they're very confident or very self-aware, but they'll have a very low self-image. The next thing, they'll often have a fluctuating maturity. They will go from acting adult to sometimes acting immature. They'll act like a child. They'll throw tantrums. They'll throw pity parties. They will do things that are rash and like spend all their money when they know they got bills to pay. Go out when they know they need to get up. They will often have fluctuating maturity. They'll act immature, extremely immature, childlike at times. And this is part of it because it's the denial mechanism is associated with the dissociative continuum. And the dissociative continuum will take and revert them back when they're triggered to a childlike mentality. That's another clear symptom of codependency, is they will have a dissociative continuum within them with a childlike mentality attached to those things associated with the release mechanism primarily, and the cathartic or the venting mechanism after the situation or the episode has been triggered, or just prior to it. It'll be the escape mechanism. So it's either the escape or the release mechanism, which will cause the fluctuating maturity or the dissociative continuum to engage, creating an immature action. When you see them beginning to act immature, it's because they've been triggered. They will have a notion, in other words, they will think that their happiness depends on other people. Why is that? Well, because as a child, your happiness would depend upon those who were the primary caregivers, those in the situation. If you were, say, 10 years younger than a sibling, that could be the one that causes the codependency. So what will happen is they will become trained and conditioned to believe that their happiness will depend upon the other individual, because in all literal fulfillment, it did. You had to make daddy happy. You had to walk on eggshells because you knew he was getting ready to explode, or he would explode when he got home at such and such a time on such and such a day. Okay? And so this is where the happiness, they get the idea that their happiness depends on others. And see, they're not cognitive of this. This is all unconscious. They're oblivious to this. And so that's why as an outside observer or a counselor, you can see it. They will often have problems getting along with others. They'll have what's called black and white thinking. They will have very unbalanced relationships. Oftentimes, the more extreme the codependent, the more extreme will be their black and white thinking. They'll either be your friend or no friend, your best friend or no friend. They have very little area for gray areas in their life. They will have very unbalanced relationships. They will go to extremes. And there's a myriad of things that you can throw in there, so I'm not going to try to give you a ton of examples. They will either be independent from somebody or dependent on somebody. And, they'll call the person all the time, have to be around the person all the time, or they'll separate from them, ignore their calls. They are very much engaged in denial. It's not something that they're cognitive of. They're often called pathological liars because as children they've been trained to lie so much and to cover up what happens at home that they have become pathological liars. The thing of a pathological liar is they're in a state of denial. And oftentimes it's a constant state of denial. A somnambulist is somebody whose brain has been so overridden that they're in a constant state of suggestion. A pathological liar is somebody whose brain was in such an extreme crisis that it constantly has had to lie in order to survive. I apologize for taking so long to make this video. It's turning out to be lengthy. I thought I'd get it done in 15 minutes, so I'll speed up here. They are not able to see reality. It's not that they don't want to see reality. They're not able to. Their coping self-defense mechanisms are so overridden and in control because they've had to survive. They've had to survive situations that people shouldn't have to do. They might not have been the one that was abused, but it's worse on a person or a child to see somebody abused. Creates greater conflict, greater psychological trauma. So they cannot see reality. And this is why often people will do an intervention for somebody that has an addiction or a codependency problem. Because it'll take a multitude of people talking calmly, but also trapping them so they can't get away, because they will want to flee. This is, the all for you, all against you, want you in my life, don't want you in my life. They will often run from situations rather than trying to engage them. They will try to control and manipulate others. They will often get people to act against their will. And the reason is their survival, once again, depended upon their ability to manipulate, coerce, get along with others. Their life will be out of control. They're often what we would call borderline personality disorder, which means they have an inability to have a set, rigid lifestyle, or one with complexities in it that are kept at a norm. Let me explain that better. They won't have a regular habit of a lifestyle. They will often have a lifestyle where they will just go off and do stuff or not do things that they need to do. So their life will be out of balance. They'll have extreme behaviors that will come in and out. One of the primary things that you find with a codependent is they have an incredible amount of anxiety, primarily within the gastrointestinal system. The heart, the brain, and the peripheral nervous system, the gastrointestinal system, they all have their own memories. And the anxiety is typically stored within the gastrointestinal system or the guts. So they'll have a lot of worry. They'll worry about things they can't change. But the problem is they won't change the things that they can because of homeostasis, the conditioning that they've been raised in. The brain, the no conscious part of the brain, will want to keep them in that type of a lifestyle and not change because it's too afraid of what would happen if they did change. For instance, daddy beat mommy all the time, but we don't know what life would be like without daddy. It's more scary for the person, for the no conscious part of the brain to think about, wait a minute, he's our provider. He's my father. If he's gone, what will we do? Rather than saying, wow, he needs to be put in jail, put into an institution where he can learn to treat people right. You see? So they won't change the things that they can. And this is why you'll have a parent that turns their head or even gives money to a child that has a drug addiction because they're not able to change that, but they'll hate and worry about the other things. They will be always searching for something that's missing in their life. They will say, I just have an emptiness. I don't know what to do. I can't fill this emptiness. Well, the emptiness is coming because of all the way back into the childhood. You go around the circle all the way back to where the roots were, and there was an unfulfilled part within that base layer of homeostasis. Maslow's hierarchy, by the way, is what creates homeostasis. I should probably do a video on that. So on the first and second tier, and mine has 14 tiers, not 7 or 5, but on the first and second tiers where homeostasis is created, the conditioning. If they are not met with love, acceptance, desire to have them around, security, there will be a gap in one of those bricks. It will be missing, and they'll always be looking for something to fill it. They will not give up or do anything that will conflict with their addictive appetite or their appetite for that situation. In other words, they may whine about, I can't take being in this abusive home. I can't stand the fact that they're spending all our money on drugs. I can't stand the fact that they're addicted to animals. She brings a new cat home every week. I've heard that one before. And we had to do an intervention. I took to church, and we carried probably 30 pounds of cat manure out of that house. And it was not a happy situation for the person, nor for the people that volunteered to help me. It stunk. But you know what? The man should have put his foot down after the second cat. When you've got 30 to 40 to 50 cats, they'll eat you if you run out of food. It's not good. They won't be able to change their addictive behavior or their, I don't know why I always find guys that hurt me. I can't tell you how many times I heard that from women working. I'd say it's because you've been conditioned. You will always seek out to find a bad man. We have to change what your true belief system is on a proper partner. We have to change your value system and show that you were valued and loved. So in summation, how do you work with somebody that's codependent? The first thing is you need to pray. You need to win their trust over and pray and ask God to open their eyes. They need to be a part of that. You need to have a loving intervention. Now, how do you do it? You cannot go directly against them. If you go directly and say, you've got a problem, and then you say, you are a pig, you eat too much, boom, defense mechanisms, denial will kick in, you won't get anywhere. So how would you approach it? You would approach it like this. You know what? This outfit would look great on you, and you know it's not going to fit them. How would you like it if I could help you to alter your eating habits and maybe your exercise habits too? So you have to create a greater reward, but you have to make them aware of the need, and you have to offer them a positive, make the brain understand in the no conscious. If the brain finds a known, you see, the unknown is the most scary, painful thing for the brain to deal with. So you confront it by making known what would happen if they were to change their eating and put it in a positive outlook. And what'll happen is the positive, it'll take 25, a minimum, positive things to outweigh one negative conditioning element. And this is where support comes in. And that's why they do group therapy. Because when you have 10 people in a room, you're automatically going to get 30 to 40 positive elements out of each session. So there's a lot of psychology, even though the person that designed it didn't realize it. So you have to bring them into an awareness. You have to trust in the power of God. God can make straight that which is crooked. He can bring the healing. And then you have to address, once you've begun addressing the positives, don't do it all in one session. You have to make this several weeks. You begin discussing the things that cause the triggering of the action. Once you can identify the behavior that's out of norm and show them the positive behavior first, show them the positive behavior, the way it should be, the way they'd want it to be, identify the missing elements, the negative things that are in their life that need to be changed, then you go down and find out what it was that was not met. What need was not met? Forgiveness will have to play a key role in it. They will have to forgive and release those that have hurt them. And I can't stress that enough. That's one of the most important elements that they're going to need. All right, I do apologize. I had no intentions of taking 45 minutes to do a video, but I hope you understand codependency. It's a very complex situation. It's not as easy as people think. And that's why they'll say, well, why don't you just quit smoking? I did it. Well, maybe you didn't have the triggers and the conditioning within your early childhood that then became associated with tobacco, the release in your early teens. Or you didn't have a spouse or parents that would always smoke after everything calmed down, and the smell of smoke means, oh, the trial's over, so now you became a smoker later on. There's always the triggering conditioning element. All right, this is Dr. Knotts. I pray the Lord blesses you in all your ways. In Christ's name, amen.